As the Dean told you, I have been concerned recently about equality. And because my colleague Amartya Sen talked about the paradoxes of liberty, I felt I had to say something on the side of the paradoxes of equality, even if it meant stretching the idea of paradox a bit. But still, I think there are paradoxes or dilemmas, or in any event, hard issues about equality raised by the question I've been writing about, namely, what is equality? The first difficulty is raised when one says, well, when would you count two people as equal? What is the goal of equality? Do we want to count people as equal, so far as politics can make them equal, when they have the same resources available with which to lead their lives? Or do we want to count them as equal when they achieve the same degree of happiness in their lives? And of course, this is a very different goal. These are two very different goals, because it might be that people have the same amount of money, but because one has certain ambitions or suffers from melancholy, or for a wide variety of other reasons, perhaps he or she is handicapped, doesn't get as much satisfaction out of his life as somebody who has the same amount of money. We can't, however, make people equal in the resources at their command and at the same time make them equal in welfare, because if you try to make people equally happy, you're going to have to make them unequal in their resources. If you make them equal in their resources, you will be making them unequal in the satisfaction that they achieve from their lives, however that might be measured. And which is it to be? Well, now, in the two-part article that was mentioned in the introduction, I argue that the goal of making people equal in satisfaction and happiness, however other description you want to choose of welfare, is in fact a false goal, that we should aim at making people equal in the resources each has available with which to lead his or her life. That should be the goal of political equality. But of course, once you say that, then you raise another difficult issue, indeed another kind of paradox. And the reason for worrying about this is the extreme difficulty of distinguishing between a person and the circumstances of that person. What is it to make people equal in the resources which they control? This idea is sometimes expressed in the slogan, we should seek equality of opportunity. But what is equality of opportunity? It's often said, for example, that it follows from the ideal of equality of opportunity that someone who's black should have the same opportunities available as someone who is white. That race or national origin or religion, linguistic stock, that none of these should make a difference in what one can have, the advantages, opportunities, and so forth that one has from one's life, and that's very appealing. It used to be said by people who were anxious to combat racial prejudice. It's now often said by people as an objection to programs called affirmative action programs, which are designed to remove some of the vestiges of past discrimination. When affirmative action programs are launched, which say, for example, that quotas should be established so that blacks in the United States, for example, have a certain representation in professional schools, people say, well, that denies equality of opportunity because no one should have greater advantage simply because he's black any more than people should have greater advantage because they're white. Well, very well, that seems a sensible statement. But what's the difference between race on the one hand and intelligence on the other hand? Does the ideal of equality of opportunity mean that people should not have more opportunities because they happen to be clever? Well, that, of course, if we took that idea seriously, that, of course, would change and destroy the meritocratic base of selection, which we use for university acceptance, quite conventionally, and in some cases quite enthusiastically. Do we mean, when we say equality of opportunity, that not only should people of different races have the same opportunity, not only, though this would be much more controversial, people of different intelligence levels, talents have the same opportunities? Do we mean that people of different ambitions should have the same opportunities, so that people who, for example, want to lead lives to be described only in advertisements in the New Yorker magazine, that is, lives of consumption, should be able to have the same opportunity to realize their ambitions as people of more modest ambitions have to realize theirs? In other words, once you launch the idea of equality of opportunity, what differences amongst people ought to make a difference once we've decided that certain differences ought not to make a difference? My own view on this is that we ought to enforce a distinction between a person and that person's circumstances, because that's the distinction we're after, which assigns to the person all matters of belief about what is valuable in life, so that if two people differ in their ambitions, one, for example, wishing to be a poet and the other a politician, that those differences ought to make a difference in the resources that people end up with. Because one life is a much more expensive life to lead than another life. And the differences between these two people ought to be reflected in how much they end up with, because these are differences in the beliefs that each has about what gives value to life. And to abbreviate a rather long argument, which I make in the second of the two articles just described, people's choice of values ought to be for their own account. But everything that can't be incorporated in the idea of a choice of what kind of life to lead, things like differential talent, certainly including differences in intelligence, difference in racial background, and so forth, ought not to make a difference in the degree of resources that people have available. Now, we need some sort of scheme or model with which to describe, or through which to describe, how a system responding to that ideal would work. Let me describe the recommendation that I make. We ought to aim at distributing private property so that people end up with what they would have under a strange ideal form of auction. Suppose everyone began with an equal number of counters or chips which you can spend for auction, and all the goods of society were to be distributed in accordance with the result of an auction, so that, for example, if I wished a particular piece of land to live on, I would have to bid against others from an initially equal stock of chips or counters. And if I won the auction by bidding more than others could bid, then I would have less counters to bid against them in the future. And at the end of this entire mythical process of auctioning, I would have a rather different stock of goods from the stock that you had, because I would have chosen to spend my initial equal stock of chips or counters differently from the way you would have chosen to spend it. But the following test would be satisfied. I would not envy your bundle of goods, and you would not envy my bundle of goods, because I would, by hypothesis, prefer the bundle that I have to the bundle that you have, and you would prefer your bundle to mine. Why? Because otherwise we would have spent our chips differently. Now, this long story about the auction is simply designed to indicate one strategy for, at a very theoretical and abstract level, giving some content to the idea of what equality of resources would be, where the resources that people have would differ because of their different ambitions, their different tastes, their different theories about what gives value to life, rather than differences in their capacity to earn, traceable either to their differing intelligence or their differing talents or their differing races, for example. Well, now, I say all that by way of background because I want to give you a sense of what picture I have in mind of what would count, a rough schematic description of it, what would count as equality of distribution in private property. That's not what I want to talk about this evening, though it's necessary to some of the things I'm going to say, and that's why I bored you with it. I want to talk about not equality in private resources, but the rather different subject of political equality. Because even once we've decided what it would be like for everyone to have the same share of society's goods, which I mean to suggest to you by this fable of the auction with equal counters, even once we've decided that, the question remains, are there any decisions to be made collectively through the political process? The answer must surely be yes. For example, there will always be the question of whether some of the resources of the community should not be distributed privately according to the auction, but should be owned publicly. And what will those be? And once we've decided that, for example, a particular block of land should be kept in the public domain, should it be used for a tennis court, or should it be used for a public garden, or should it be used for an opera house or a sports stadium? These are issues that might fall to be decided collectively. What shall the criminal justice system be like? What shall be made crimes? How shall we try criminals? What sentences shall be given to criminals? These are all questions which, in the normal course of things, will be decided politically through a political process and will not be decided simply in response to the question, well, how should private goods be distributed, which is the question I mean to have approached through the idea of the auction. So even when we have what I tried to describe in the two-part article, namely a theory of equality in private property, the crucially important question remains, what would be political equality? Think of political power as a resource. What would count as equality in its distribution? There's a quick way to restate the question. If we suppose that democracy is that form of government predicated upon equality of political power, then the question could be put, what really, properly understood, is democracy? Now, I think we can distinguish, just as I began by distinguishing on the private side between two general theories, equality of welfare and equality of resources, I propose to you that we can begin thinking about what equality in political power would be like by distinguishing between an input theory of equality in political power and an outcome theory. And I have in mind just what that suggests. An input theory of a political equality would say, political power is equally distributed, democracy is genuinely realized when everyone has an equal vote, when everyone has the same say, person by person, in deciding what the Constitution shall be like, who shall be the officials, what decision the officials will make, all the things that fall to be voted. And people will have equal political power even when the outcome of this process, as it might very well be, is a very unequal distribution in the sense of that some people will get a lot of what they want through that process and others will get practically nothing because some will be in the majority and others will be in the minority. An input test says what the upshot of the process at the end of the day will be is important to be sure, but it doesn't touch the question of whether there was equality of political power because, for example, in a town meeting, simple form of political decision-making. If everyone has one vote, that is equality of political power. An outcome approach, on the other hand, says there is no way to describe equality of political power ex ante by looking on the input side. The only way to decide whether political power is equally distributed through a community is exactly by looking at the upshot of the process to see whether the decisions reached are in some sense fair. Now, there's a great argument, there has been a great argument over the years about whether input theories or outcome theories are better theories about the distribution, equal distribution of political power. The paradox I have in mind is that there seem crushing and final objections to both of them. Let me begin by talking about the objections that I see to an input theory of political equality. Suppose there are, as often there are in communities, permanent minorities across a wide range of public decisions. These could be racial minorities, these could be religious minorities, the tragedy of Northern Ireland. These could be, on the other hand, cultural minorities, ethnic minorities of different sorts, but they could also simply be minorities of political conviction. There could be a small, not in your sense, but in the sense I mean to use, liberal group within a basically conservative setting. And if we say equality of political power is achieved simply by giving each person one vote and one side always loses, then there's something bizarre about describing as a situation as having or consisting in equality of political power in which one group, namely the minority, has no political power at all, in the very real sense that whether they exercise their vote or not will make no difference to their fate. If the issue, for example, suppose to take a ribald and, however, nicely crude and simple example, suppose the community is divided into a majority of art enthusiasts and a minority of sports spectator enthusiasts, and the questions come steadily before the town meeting, one by one, whether public resources shall be used to buy pictures for the museum or to build facilities such as gymnasia. And if one by one the minority loses these issues, then the minority is in the position that its political power has absolutely no value to it. It is no better off than if it didn't have a vote at all. Now, that's a suggestion that there's something odd, bizarre, about saying this is a position of political equality. But I think the troubles with the input theory are, in a way, even more serious, because once we expand the idea of the input of political power beyond the notion of a vote to include voice, to include, for example, participation through lobbying, through speaking, through assembly, through the myriad ways in which we, some better than others, influence political decisions, then not only does a pure input test seem unfair, but it also seems incoherent, because I don't see how we have any metric for measuring whether someone's ability to influence the political decision through these ways other than voting, these important ways, is the same as the next person's. What could that mean? Once we say that it doesn't mean the ability to have what you want. But of course, once we say the metric is ability to have what you want, then we've switched from a pure input test to an outcome test. Well, is the upshot of this, however, that we should be concerned with an outcome test, that we should reject the conventional input test of democracy and instead accept an outcome test? Once again, there seem to me crushing objections. to using an outcome test. And these are, in a way, parallel to the objections I've made to using an input test. Because when we switch from the kind of issue that I described a moment ago, namely how shall public resources be used? Shall we buy yet another Titian at the cost of building a basketball stadium? When we switch from that kind of a question to a question like, what shall the criminal justice system be like? Should there be capital punishment? What provision should be made in society for the handicapped? When we switch to questions of that character, which also fall to the political process for decision, then it seems quite wrong to suppose that everyone should in some way have a certain slice of things going his or her way. If there were a permanent minority of hawks, for example, on criminal justice, we would not think that the ideal of equality of political power could be realized only by saying, if they formed 1/3 of the community, for 1/3 of the criminals who are convicted of crime, those thirds should be executed, because that would somehow represent the authority proportionately of that one group. On issues of this sort, we don't believe that a system is unfair if one side consistently loses, whereas on the other issues I mentioned, we did think that. Once again, it not only seems odd and bizarre to suppose that political equality is only realized by equality of result, of outcome, by a fair distribution, by somebody getting his way some of the time. When we switch to issues of that sort, once again there's the problem of incoherence. What would it mean to say, I had gotten my way a proportionate amount of the time, therefore I had equal political power, when we were thinking about the design of the criminal justice system? I don't see what it could mean. Now, if there are these objections to a pure input theory of political equality, if there are, as I've suggested, parallel objections to a pure outcome theory, why then the solution would have to lie in some combination of both of these, in a more complex theory of political equality and a more complex theory of democracy. And the resolution of this putative paradox of political equality would have to lie in constructing some different, more complex bicameral theory of political equality, which gave the right role to input and the right role to outcome in some overall theory of political equality. And that is exactly what I think we lack in the literature, and what we must, if we're enthusiasts for political equality, if we're enthusiasts for democracy, what we must try to develop. Now, the germ of the suggestion that I would make as to how we might construct a superior theory of political equality is latent in the examples that I just used. Because the examples traded on a distinction between kinds of political issues, for one of which an input flavored approach seemed right. Pay attention to whether people have equal votes. And for some of which an outcome flavored solution seemed right. And we ought to see whether we can make more precise, or in any event make distinctions which would allow us to think further about the necessary distinction, and then to see how that distinction would be developed. And the distinction that I want to propose, in any event the language I want to propose that we use with which to make it, is this. I think we ought to say that people vote and exercise their other political powers like speech, assembly, lobbying, and so forth, so as to express, give voice to, represent their preferences, but that people have at least two kinds of preferences which they seek to exhibit and enforce through the political process. One of these groups of preferences I want to call factors of decision. And I mean by that expression only this. Some of people's preferences provide, just in the fact that people happen to have those preferences, a justification for a political decision. If, as I think, it turns out that more people want an opera house than a gymnasium, just the fact that that is how preferences lie in the community provides a justification for a community building opera houses in preference to gymnasia. If it turns out that the spread of the preferences people have are not like that at all, I want to say, for example, that the fact that any number of people have a preference for capital punishment provides no argument at all for capital punishment. And in case you think I'm simply reflecting my own views in this, the fact that people oppose capital punishment in itself provides no argument against it. Now, I must be clear about this. I don't mean that the reasons people have don't provide, for having the preference don't provide a justification. If the reasons are good, then they do provide a justification. If the reasons are bad, they provide no justification at all. With respect to these issues, which in distinction to factors of decision, the first kind of preference, I want to call judgment preferences. With respect to judgment preferences, the fact that people happen to have a particular judgment should count for nothing by way of a justification, though if their reasons are good, the reasons ought to count a great deal towards the justification of a political decision, one way rather than another. So you see the general drift of the argument. I want, instead of taking people's preferences as homogeneous, I want to try and enforce a distinction amongst these, and then to say something which we might tentatively describe this way. When we are concerned with giving effect to preferences which we call factors, which we decide are factors of decision, that is, preferences such that the very fact that people have those preferences weighs with us, we ought to design a political system which will give them weight as such. And that will be in the direction of an outcome-directed test of political equality. Because so far as we're concerned with those preferences, what we want through the political process is a scheme such that, to put it crudely, decisions are made roughly in proportion to the weight and play of preferences. But when we are concerned with judgment questions, judgment preferences, we ought to have no ambition to construct a system such that the outcome, for example, shall we have capital punishment or not, is in some way the product of the majority will on that question. Now, that's a rough and tentative classification, and I'm going to take a good part of it back. At least I'm going to suggest that we take away the terms outcome and input at the end. I use them only to trade on, to advance the argument a bit. But of course, the question that you'll have in your mind just now, if you have any sympathy with this approach at all, the question you'll have in mind is, how do we decide which kinds of issues are factor issues, which kinds of preferences should be factors of decision, so that the distribution of those preferences itself is reflected in the outcome, and which kind ought we to treat differently as judgment issues. Now, I have my own opinion about that, but it doesn't help for me simply to state that. What I want to suggest to you is a strategy you ought to follow in deciding what, in your opinion, is the right way to make that distinction. And the strategy that I have in mind is simply this. Regard a political theory as constructed at two levels. At the first level, the question I've now put is raised. The first level for political theory is this, or at least that part of political theory that's concerned with democracy, or with fair voting, fair distribution of political power. The first question is, which decisions are decisions such that the fact of preferences ought not to matter, and which are decisions such that they ought to matter? And the answer to that question, given at this first initial threshold level of political theory, will of course be given by your theory of justice. And to exhibit the differences, let's consider one or two, or possibly three, theories which would have an answer to that question. Consider the favorite whipping boy of political philosophers, utilitarianism. Utilitarianism, as you know, is the theory that that is just, which takes many forms. Let's take the simplest form, makes most people happy over the long run. Increases the total or average happiness throughout the community. Now, if that's your theory of justice, then the answer that you will give to the level one question, what should this distinction be? The answer you will give is, every issue except this one should be an issue in which preferences count as factors. There are no judgment issues except this one. I keep saying except this one because even utilitarianism, I believe, would be in a genuine paradox if it argued that whether utility was the right theory of justice depended upon whether utility pleased people. Some utilitarians have tried to take that line, but I think that a sensible utilitarian would at least exempt that issue. But nevertheless, having said that, a utilitarian would say every other issue, capital punishment, for example, is only an issue about the play of preferences. If, on the other hand, you had, instead of utilitarianism, of a theory of the sort I sketched at the beginning of these remarks, if you thought that goods ought to be distributed across the community so that everyone had an equal share of resources available with which to execute whatever plans he formed for his own life, if that was the theory that appealed to you, and if you were moved to continue it, to elaborate that theory in the way I did at the outset by speaking glibly about this hypothetical auction in which everyone starts with the same amount of chips, then you would say, the distinction between those kind of issues which we should regard as factors and those only as judgment preferences goes like this. We must distinguish between the construction of the auction and the play of the auction. We must distinguish between questions like, should the handicapped be given extra counters at the beginning in order to make the auction fair? Questions like, should someone's liberty or life be itself a good to be auctioned? Because after all, that's what the criminal justice process is. It treats people's liberty and sometimes even their lives as resources to be used to deter others. Should those be part of the auction or not? Any question which struck you as a question that was preliminary to the operation of this hypothetical auction would be a question of judgment, not a question which would be remitted to the auction itself, because of course it would be quite incoherent to allow the auction to determine its own design. But once the design was fixed, then how the auction would run, what resources would end up as a result of the auction in private hands as against public hands, and how the public property would be used, whether a gymnasium would be built or a sports stadium, why, that ought to be, following out this line, that ought to be something in which the play of preferences was decisive. Because the play of preferences is, in fact, what would determine how the auction would be run, how people would spend their counters, and what the distribution would be. I said I was going to mention, just by way of exhibiting how different political theories would give different answers to this, a third political theory. And I'll do it quickly, and only for a special reason, not really, which is something of a detour. When Professor Sen talked about the paradoxes of liberty, or the paradox of liberty, which he discovered, he suggested to you that that paradox depends upon something called the Pareto principle, something familiar to and cherished by most economists, which says roughly and crudely that if everyone in the community prefers one state of affairs to another, then justice or the correct evaluation of those states of affairs ought to prefer the first to the second as well. If it's unanimous that the first is better than the second, why then, surely, from the standpoint of collective choice theory, the first is better than the second. Now, my footnote is that if you make the distinction that I've suggested between classes of preferences, then we have to deal with not one, but two Pareto principles. One Pareto principle, which would be all-embracing and include matters of judgment as well as factors of decision, and another of which would be limited to factors of decision only. I want to suggest to you, and perhaps we can discuss this in question time if anybody wants to pursue it, that the paradox that Professor Sen described will be realized only if we take the first, more embracing Pareto notion. But once we've made the distinction, we've subverted any appeal of a Pareto principle that wide. I say this, my special reason for saying this is only, once again, to provide an even weaker and more laughable justification for my title by suggesting this connection between the two lectures. But that is a detour, and I want to return to the theme. Suppose you have worked out, by thinking about your general political theory, by thinking about your general theory of justice, remitting the question in this way of political equality back to the more basic questions about equality of resources that I began by mentioning. Suppose you have worked out which factors you regard as, which kinds of preferences you regard as factors and which kind you regard as judgments. Now, how should you respond by designing a political system fairly, so that people have equality of political power? Well, we ought to take it in two steps and then to see how we'd merge them together. Suppose we wanted to be fair with respect to the factors of decision, people's preferences that ought to have impact in the way in which I've tried to describe. We must create something of an outcome test. There is no magic at all in one person, one vote notions of democracy when we're concerned with creating a system which will produce the desired effect, namely, well, what is the desired effect? We want the political process, when we're, so far as we're concerned with that kind of preference, we want the political process to mimic an auction. Indeed, we want to think of the political process as a kind of auction. Instead of, as in my first myth, everyone starting with 1,000 chips and bidding for Blackacre or bidding for Park Row as in a Monopoly game, imagine that votes were counters, and that when issues came up of the sort, how shall this piece of land be used by the community? Shall it be a museum or shall it be a gymnasium? People actually bid by saying, I will spend
15 of my votes, and the one willing to spend more of their initial stock, equal stock of votes, would win. And of course there'd be combinations, so there'd be groups would be bidding against one another and win. But of course, the group that won on that issue would have less counters available, less votes available to bid on the next issue. So in this way, we'd try and mimic, if we could do this, we would try and mimic an auction through the political process. Now, the ordinary political process can't work this way for the very simple reason that when you vote today, you don't lose your voting power tomorrow. It isn't like spending chips. But we have various ways to make it more like spending chips. One of the ways we have is by nourishing what are often called imperfections in the political process. Log rolling, political parties, trades, deals among parties, all these things that we sometimes regard as indices of corruption in the political process actually help to bring us closer to the desired goal of seeing the political process as an auction in which if you win today, you lose tomorrow. And I think that when we're thinking about the political process having in mind only these kinds of issues, we ought to be quite imaginative. We ought to think about about federalizing, about making some issues in which are decided locally, others nationally, about two houses of Congress, bicameral parliaments. We ought to think very long and hard about tampering with one person, one vote. Because one person, one vote, as I said before, is in this area nothing but a hypothesis, and a rather poor hypothesis, about how to make the system closer to the ideal of a true auction. But now, what about the other side? What about judgments? What about when we're trying to decide not whether the community shall buy more pictures for the museum or build a gymnasium, but whether we shall have capital punishment, whether criminals should be entitled to lawyers, the right against self-incrimination, differently, whether the handicapped should have extra resources, whether affirmative action programs should be placed in train. Judgment issues, issues of justice. What shall we decide about that? Well, one idea we have to take very seriously is these issues have no place in politics at all. These are not political issues. If politics is a machine for mimicking as best we can the auction of preferences, but as to these issues we don't think preferences should weigh, all that should weigh are arguments, then perhaps we should take them out of politics altogether. Suppose there were a kind of philosophical coup. I mean, a group of philosophers take over the government. The Kantians take over the airport, and the Wittgensteinians take over the broadcasting system, and simply announce that as a result of this coup, henceforth certain issues, namely issues of justice, judgment issues as I've called them, will no longer be settled by democracy, but will instead be settled by the Council of Philosophers meeting in the central hall of the Humanities Building. What's wrong with that? Well, it's not I don't think it's as silly a question as you think it is. Though in the end of the day, we wouldn't accept it, but it's worth pausing to figure out why. You see, is it because we think that the Council of Philosophers, let's have a different suggestion, instead of the philosophers marching on the airports, because they probably wouldn't get very far, let's think about a special house of the legislature being created by election by deans of law schools and chairmen from time to time of philosophy departments, and we should even include political science departments, and a half a vote to the economics department, for example. And we launch this. Now, let's call this the academic college. Do you have any reason for thinking that the academic college would do a worse job? than the democracy would do in coming to the right decision. Now, I should say, of course, you might be skeptical that there is a right decision. You might believe that on issues like capital punishment or abortion or affirmative action or aid to underprivileged or criminal justice, all of these issues I've mentioned, you may think that there is no right answer. Indeed, Learned Hand, whom I mentioned a while ago, was rather inclined to the view that there's no right answer and liked democracy for that reason. I don't think that's any reason. If there's no right answer, it doesn't matter who reaches the wrong one. Why not let the academic council? But if you abstain thyself from skepticism a while and you think actually there are right answers, and if you don't want to use the awful phrase right answer, which I do, you might want to say there are better answers. If you think there are better answers to questions like these, why is a college, an academic college, antecedently less likely to reach the better answer than the demos? Now, I think that if we object to the academic college, it can't be because we think they're less likely to reach the right answer. I think it's because we believe that participation in politics is itself a good. And it's good for people. And if we exclude some people from the process, as we would, for example, if we allowed only people of us from a certain section to vote, then we would be denying the people whom we exclude not only the kind of respect, equal respect, that members of a community of equals are entitled to have, but worse, would be denying them something important. It's a familiar point made by Mill and many other people, but nonetheless sound, made recently rather prominently by John Rawls. Would be denying people of an opportunity to exercise a capacity that's terribly important. And indeed, I think if people were not able to exercise the capacity of having to decide what they think about matters of judgment and vote accordingly, that not only their capacity for public justice, but probably their capacity for justice in general, and possibly even their capacities for making judgments of value about their own lives would, if not wither, at least atrophy. So I think there are good reasons, but, and this is a sovereign point I want to make in this part of my remarks, these have very little to do with any idea of equality of either outcome or input. Certainly these reasons for wanting to leave some issues with the community, even though these are issues of judgment, they don't have to do with outcome equality, because we reject, don't we, the idea that we want to aim at a situation where a minority of hawks, for example, on criminal justice, win a minority of votes. We want to reject that idea entirely. We want to reject log rolling. A moment ago, I spoke rather fulsomely in praise of log rolling on certain kinds of issues. I mean, when a senator goes and says, look, you vote with me on the opera, and I'll vote with you next time on the gymnasium. That kind of log rolling makes the political process closer to the auction, because it's a question of losing some of your political power for the future in order to gain some now, and it's excellent. But if we approached questions of justice in that spirit, where a senator said, you vote with me on the Opera House today and I'll vote with you for capital punishment tomorrow, we would be appalled. And that seems to me an excellent test that we're not interested in auction equality of outcome on these issues. Are we interested in equality of input? I don't really think so. And in this way, I want to take back a bit of what I said earlier about issues of judgment being essentially input questions. I don't think so. I think what we're interested in is simply a threshold of participation. I think we want, in this way, to give people voice in the collective decisions under the title of justice made by the community, because it is important for people to have that opportunity to exercise that capacity. That is the sovereign purpose. And if that's right, then we must set ourselves a threshold. The threshold, for example, must include education, and indeed education in the humanities, presently at least in 2 countries I'm associated with, under something of a financial threat, is an essential, it seems to me, for the development of that kind of capacity. We must give reasonable opportunity to people who want voice to find voice, to be able to speak to their contemporaries, to be able to speak to their colleagues, to be able to say to the community, this I believe under the title of justice. But I think these are all threshold notions, and that once this has been achieved, though this is I think, will strike you a very odd thing to say, once that's achieved, I think of any further efforts towards equality in the matter of voice incoherent. I don't understand what would be aimed at beyond that, how it would be measured, or what the point of seeking it would be. Well, now, I'm leading up to the following 2 points, and perhaps these ought to introduce the coda. First, everything I think I've said in the last part of the remarks provides an argument, a tentative argument, subject to one important qualification, for constitutionalizing matters of justice, by which I mean debating publicly, giving voice to opinion about what are the fundamental requirements of justice, and then removing those further, henceforth, I should say, from the political process by establishing them in a constitution of the sort that you are now in train of having. It's often said that constitution and democracy are at war, that by sinking, entrenching a particular opinion in a constitution, for example, that people shall not be required to testify against themselves in criminal proceedings, that by entrenching that in a constitution, you are derogating from democracy, particularly when you have it in mind that at the end of the day, non-elected judges will have the final say about what it means, which might be at variance with the opinion of the majority about what it means. Now, that is not a threat to any important idea of political equality. It's always said to be a threat. It seems to me no threat at all, provided we're clear that the issues being entrenched are judgment issues and not issues which depend upon preferences as factors of decision. That's the important question. Of course, we might get that wrong. But if we're confident that it's right, and surely questions, the major questions of fairness in criminal procedure are such questions, once we've gotten it right, notions of political equality, it seems to me, provide no argument against constitutionalizing, save for this one qualification, and it seems to me the major one. If we constitutionalize too much, then we invade the threshold I spoke of a few minutes ago by removing from the community and making the exclusive province of lawyers key and central issues of political morality, which ought to be debated from time to time, not because the majority is right or the majority should have its will, but simply because a community is the poorer when these ideas are taken out of the forum so that people need no longer give voice or hear voice and reflect. But constitutionalizing needn't have that result, it just might. It needn't have that result, provided the professions, and I have in mind particularly lawyers, academic lawyers, and political philosophers and political theorists, do not allow it to. Steps towards constitutionalization, towards removing issues from politics, must be the signal for a renewed occupation with those issues as matters of public and professional debate, in which people whose special provinces they are speak to the rest of the nation and invite the rest of the nation to that there be equality in that impact, and that's half the burden. And that burden will be created not by any mechanical one person, one vote, but by careful attention to outcomes and by fiddling with the process so as to reach the outcome, just as we would fiddle with the design of the auction in my first example. Political equality in the second idea is simply, once again, I don't even think it's so much an egalitarian notion. It's once again the celebration of participation, which is the earnest and essence of participation as a member of a free and equal community. It's to be safeguarded not by any mechanical arrangement of votes, once again, one vote, one person. It's to be safeguarded not by resisting constitutionalism. It's to be safeguarded only through intelligence, voice, and argument. Thank you.